Mohammed El-Kurd, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you so much for having me.
You grew up in Sheikh Jarrah, a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which has been under threat of dispossession for decades. In fact, in 2009, settlers forcibly entered your home and took over part of it. Can you talk about what it was like to witness something like that as a child, and how those kinds of experiences in the neighborhood shaped your identity?
Funny enough, witnessing settlers, like foreign-born settlers, come into our house and take it forcibly was the norm, because our neighborhood was one of the many neighborhoods around occupied Palestine that has been facing forced expulsion. And it only was when I grew up that I realized how absurd it was that this was happening. And there were people who were saying that it was divine decree that they take over our houses and they turn our neighborhoods from Palestinian to Israeli. But I think, if I were to unpack it, it must have been very traumatic to witness something and to just have such powerlessness instilled in you as a child. But then again, you almost feel as though you are lucky that your house was only taken and not, blown up the way it is in the Gaza Strip, for example, or in parts of the West Bank, like in Tul Karam and Jenin, and so on. So it situates you in this kind of like hierarchy of oppression that's really messed up. And it really alters your outlook on the world.
So you have a new book out, which we're going to get into greater detail about in a bit. But in it, you write that, quote, "The very moment that a Palestinian exits the womb, he is unchilded, flung away from childhood, and treated as both a good-for-nothing nobody and a dangerous ticking time bomb at once." How did you experience this idea of being unchilded?
Well, first of all, I should just say that the concept of being unchilded is something that's been coined by Palestinian academic Nadir Kurvakian to talk about the kind of policies that Palestinians children endure. In my particular case, it's not necessarily it's unique in some aspects, and it's very common in many other aspects. The fact that you are treated like an adult from the very beginning of your life, and you're treated there is no way to coddle you or shelter you from the reality of the occupation. There is not a time when your parents are going to have the talk with you, because you see it from the first time you open your eyes. And also the Israeli occupation forces treat you as though you are a threat on the checkpoint, in the street, on your way to school, and so on and so forth. But for me and for many other Palestinian children, also you are sometimes you kind of volunteer or somehow find yourself into the role of the advocate as a child. We saw this demonstrated in its most flagrant form in the Gaza Strip when Palestinian children put on this so-called children's press conference, and they stood, many of them, behind the podium and pleaded with the world to stop the bombing, to stop the genocide of the Gaza Strip. And for many Palestinian children, this is a role you take on because you recognize, or the NGOs that come, or the activists and the human rights organizations that come to your neighborhood recognize that lawmakers around the world, that adult audiences around the world are quite racist against Palestinians, particularly Palestinian men. And so we burden our children with the task of giving humans eyes for humanity. We ask them to memorize these talking points, to memorize this history.
Is the idea that the world may be more generous, they may have more grace for Palestinian children than Palestinian adults, that the racism doesn't quite seep into their perception of the children as much?
That's the idea. That's the theory. But on the contrary, I think the world has a lot of disdain for Palestinian children.
That actually brings me to the title of your book. Again, it's a new book. It's called Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal. This idea of the perfect victim is very provocative and compelling. What's a perfect victim?
It's a mythical creature, the perfect victim, I think. Certainly, I don't think it's not a new idea. Certainly in the Black struggle, we've heard a lot about perfect victims. We've heard people make the critique of perfect victimhood. Also in the women's rights movement, right? When we're talking about victims of sexual assault, it's often demanded of women to portray this infallible dispossession, this affect of complete innocence. But this paradigm of innocence is not only unattainable, but it really throws so many people under the bus. So many people who are unable to assume these characteristics. Oftentimes we talk about, women and children as the main victims of war. And people will critique that framework and they'll say, but don't forget the Palestinian men, and they will qualify it by saying, and the Palestinian men, because they are gentle fathers and they are loving figures and blah, blah, blah. My argument, and I think it's, an argument that's been made before, but I tried to just really situate it in a Palestinian context, is that those Palestinian men could be absolutely abhorrent and they still deserve dignity and liberation, because there is not an affect or a certain personality that you must portray or must employ before you are worthy of human rights.
You talk about the ways in which Palestinians are saved from dehumanization, bringing up issues of class, race, nationality. An example of this was when the Israeli military shot dead my colleague, Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. A lot of the media focus was placed on the fact that she was a U.S. passport holder. How does this emphasis on her citizenship reflect a kind of broader pattern around marginalizing Palestinian identity?
Like you said, it distances her from her Palestinianness, and it's like, I hate to say it, but it's almost every day that a Palestinian journalist is killed and shot, and it's very, very seldom that they make it into the headlines. And if they do make it into the headlines, they are often vilified. The headlines will claim that they have ties to Hamas, or that they were, doing something suspicious, or that they were in a place they shouldn't be. And we think it's a strategy by emphasizing someone's Americanness or someone's British passport. We think it is going to deliver us justice. But in the case of Shireen, may God rest her soul, in the case of Shireen, the only thing it has delivered is more commotion and more fuss in the media, but it hasn't given her justice. And on the contrary, it has made it even harder for us to advocate on behalf of slain Palestinian journalists who do not have these foreign passports. Because, being a journalist targeted by Israeli snipers is an atrocity within itself, but we are telling Palestinian journalists, no, that's not enough. You also need to be a citizen of this very privileged country, or you need to be a Christian because most Palestinians are Muslim, and that's really a boring story, or you need to be a woman, and you need to be this, and you need to be that. And all of that is irrelevant. It demands of the Palestinians and advocates and activists to double their efforts when it should be a straightforward story. There's a journalist that was shot in broad daylight, as witnesses say, as cameras have documented, and it should be rejected worldwide. We should not
that should be enough.
We should not have to build this impossible case.
Do you ever find yourself susceptible or compelled by that sort of tendency to prioritize the special people and the perfect victims? I ask because as an activist in the United States, I would see the black kid who gets killed who's going to college on Monday or who goes to Harvard as this great example to show the world, see, it doesn't matter how perfect you are, they're going to kill you anyway. There's a temptation to move away from the harder cases. The person who was shot with his hands up, even if he had a criminal record or she had a criminal record. Do you ever find yourself kind of compelled by those perfect victim narratives?
Oh, certainly, all the time, every day. There was a video of victims of the horrific pager attack in Lebanon, and it was like a montage of the victims, and the first two, I think, were men, and then the later victims were kids. And I was just thinking in the back of my head, it would have been a better editorial decision to have the kids in the front. But you recognize how absolutely, I don't know whether to call it heartbreaking or dangerous or scary, that it's been drilled, these tendencies have been drilled into you to create these hierarchies into your mind, to editorialize suffering because you think and recognize that the audience is not going to be receptive to certain people, and you erase them or you push them to the back end of the video because you are pleading with a racist audience. But you have to I think you just have to be honest about it as an activist or as a writer. I was writing about another Palestinian American citizen, Omar Asad, who was blindfolded, gagged, and left to die in the cold in the West Bank by the Israeli military. And I remember, and I wrote about this at the end of the essay, I remember that I had spent maybe an hour looking for an article that condemned that he was beaten as well, because in the back of my head, it was not enough that he was blindfolded and gagged. I needed him to be beaten too in order for him to be compelling. Now, I asked myself, what does that say about my psyche? What does that say about what has been done to my insides? And it's a scary question.
There is a stark contrast in how we discuss state-sanctioned violence compared to the actions of those who are resisting oppression. I'd like to ask, beyond issues of race, class, and nationality, how are victims perceived when they choose to engage in armed resistance? What determines whether their actions are seen as legitimate or not?
This is a country where some states have trespassing laws, like some states have stand your ground laws. I remember I was mind blown when I first heard about the idea that if you stand in someone's lawn, they can shoot you or something. Yeah. So it took me a while, but I now realize that the idea that Americans, Europeans simply don't understand resistance or the right to defend yourself is simply a mythical idea. It's not true. They understand resistance. It's just that they don't like when we do it.
Who is the we? Is it just Palestinians? Is it Arabs? Is it brown people?
I think it's people who, I think black and brown people make up the vast majority of that demographic, but I think it's people who threaten empire. Because, in the north of Ireland, the whiteness of the Irish skin did not really absolve them from the violence, and it did not, we did not valorize them as national heroes or resistance heroes when they engaged in armed resistance against the British Empire. So, it's tempting to say, I think the majority of the population is black and brown, but I think it's anybody who threatens the empire. But yeah, and I think sometimes it's like you said, it's so staggering, it's almost comical. There was I write about this in one of the chapters, but it was like a study that was done by the New York War Crimes, which is a collective that, is an H-pop like newspaper that tries to hold the New York Times accountable. And they just did a comparative study of how resistance in Ukraine is covered in the New York Times and how resistance in Palestine is. And, the New York Times glorifies the guerrilla warfare tactics of the Ukrainians. It glorifies and romanticizes them blending in and out of the population, wearing civilian clothes. Meanwhile, wow. It calls it, when Palestinians do it, it calls it hiding behind human shields and so on and so forth. So the difference is staggering. But I think we must move past just the double standard and understand why that double standard applies. It's not that the editors of the New York Times are morons. I mean, they are, in my opinion, but it's not that they are ignorant of what's happening. It's that they are willingly and purposefully editorializing our resistance in a way that vilifies it.
You in fact, highlight an example from CNN when TV host Christian Amanpour asks an Israeli author whether it's possible to hold two thoughts at once, that October 7th was the worst thing that could have happened and that everybody has the right to live with rights and dignity, including Palestinians. But she then quickly caveats it by saying, and I'm not talking about Hamas. You took issue with this.
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's just so crazy how dehumanization of Palestinians is so normalized in mass media. It's like you cannot imagine anybody saying that about any other political party in the world. Imagine I said, all Americans deserve to live in peace and harmony, but I'm not talking about Democrats. That people would take an issue to that. But the dehumanization, saying that Palestinian fighters or Palestinians who even just support fighting deserve death is so normalized. There was another issue.
Let me push back on that just a little bit. I mean, there are people who believe in Palestinian rights, Palestinian self-determination, but take issue for political, legal, or moral reasons with the actions of Hamas, either before or after or on October 7th. Is it inherently wrong to say, hey, I support the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, I support Palestinian resistance, but I don't support, say, the kidnapping of civilians or the killing of unarmed people or civilians, however we define that, because it violates international law, etc. That you can make those moral distinctions.
But that's not what Amanpour is saying. She's saying everybody deserves to live. Everybody deserves human rights except the fighters of Hamas. She is rendering the Declaration of Human Rights, the unconditional Declaration of Human Rights, conditional. I take an issue with that. It's one thing to say, I have political issues, or I would not have conducted myself in the same manner, or certain actions deserve certain punishments, or whatever it is. But to just say wholesale, those people deserve death, it's simply racist. There was another instance on CNN when a group of journalists told this Muslim journalist, like, he was saying something about Palestinians, and somebody was like, I hope your peeper goes off, or something like that. And, there was a ruckus around the issue, and then they clarified, I thought you were talking about Hamas. And the journalist goes, no, I'm supportive of the Palestinian people. I'm not saying I'm supportive of Hamas. As if him being a supporter of Hamas, him having the political opinion or the, just the preference to support Hamas would say that it's okay to say that he deserves death. This is the culture in the United States. It's okay to deport students for their political beliefs, to expel them for their political beliefs. It's okay to ruin the careers of young academics and young writers and young scientists because of their political opinions in a so-called democracy. That's abhorrent.
This brings me to the question of who's narrating the struggle and the story of Palestinians. You critique the fact that Israeli human rights organizations, Israeli conscientious objectors, or former Israeli soldiers who decide to come clean are given a kind of precedence over the words and the accounts and the testimonies of Palestinians. Can you explain what the danger is of that arrangement where Israelis, even well-intentioned ones, get the authority of narration over Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, I just take, God bless them, first of all, yani. But I take issue with the premise. It's not that you are, as a mainstream media outlet, interviewing this Israeli human rights organizations on the basis that it's a human rights organization. You're interviewing them because they're Israeli first. And it's the idea that the audience is already suspicious of Palestinians, it's suspicious of Arabs, it's suspicious of Muslims, but it's not suspicious of Israelis. It actually finds them more credible.
So like B'Tselem, for example, becomes like...
B'Tselem, it's like, why is it that it's okay and not controversial for B'Tselem to tell the New York Times that Israelis target children, but it's somehow unreliable when the Palestinian Ministry of Health says it, or when Al-Damir or when Al-Mizan or Al-Haq says it. The issue here is racism. So if it was like, we are going to platform these testimonials on the basis of merit or on the basis of the content of the testimony itself, I wouldn't take an issue with it. But it's the identitarian basis that rubs me the wrong way. It's not we're interviewing this historian because he's excellent. No, it's because he's Jewish. And somehow that his Jewishness will make him more credible. And we do this too, not just the mainstream organizations. We say this Israeli Attorney General says that Israel is an apartheid state. Well, I can name for you 10, I can't, but I could, mention to you 10 Israeli Attorney Generals who say, no, actually this is a democracy. So then what? In the same breath, Israeli officials can bring Palestinians who will parrot their talking points. Then what? To what end are we using these identities to advance our talking points? When it should be a lot more methodological, it should be a lot more scientific, it should be, things should be, arguments and debates should be based in fact, not who said this and who said that. I think that's, a dead end.
You once stated that, quote, Zionism is the leading cause of death in occupied Palestine. It's interesting because you don't say the Israeli government, for example, you say Zionism. You don't say the settlers, you don't say the military. You say Zionism. Why?
Well, it's the material manifestations of this ideology that have caused death, and it's, the enactors of this ideology, the people who carry its baton are the settlers and the government. But I think it's the ideology itself that has created this roadmap of dispossession, of displacement, of, this lethal bureaucracy that kills Palestinians with, fines and fees, if not airstrikes and bombs. And I mention Zionism particularly because there's a dangerous conversation around the West. I think it's probably the only conversation about what does Zionism mean, or what does Zionism mean to certain people.
Exactly, because some people would say, I know Peter Beinart, for example, has said, I'm a cultural Zionist. I oppose the occupation, I oppose apartheid, but I'm a cultural Zionists. It's about the cultural symbols. It's a connection. It's a national identity. It's not about
Nazism was a national identity to some people. Like I don't know if we would take someone who would say I'm a cultural Nazi seriously. Why is it that we make the exception for Zionism?
Well, maybe not an exception, but
I mean, Nazism was a national project. It was also abhorrent and disgusting and dangerous.
Well, that's the difference, though, right? Because Nazism would be rooted in something fundamentally morally abhorrent, whereas
so is Zionism.
But Judaism isn't, and so
there is no conflation between. I make no conflation between Zionism and Judaism, but Zionism explicitly is an abhorrent project. The pioneers of Zionism have named it explicitly to be an abhorrent project of colonialism. Jabotinsky, Herzl talk about stealing our lands, talk about killing us, talk about how violence is the only way they can make their national homeland achievable.
Right.
How is that different from any chauvinistic national movement?
I think the cultural Zionists would say, yes, that's political Zionism. That's a problem. I'm just trying to affirm my Jewishness, and I don't have an interest in the settler colonial project.
I think it's irredeemably narcissistic to see bombs falling over a strip of land where people live besieged and say, actually, this is about me and you're misunderstanding me and my national ambitions.
Given that the majority of Israelis do identify as Zionists, do you think there will ever come a time where the conversation about the meaning of Zionism will change, or at least the importance of having that conversation will become more urgent?
I think the meaning of Zionism is quite clear, because a project is what it does. Like I can tell you Zionism is an ice cream machine all day long, but Zionism is a death machine, because death is what it does. It's not about what we define it as. The same way, like somebody could say ISIS is, a rebellion against something or whatever, but ISIS is not that. ISIS is a movement of beheaders, right? Like I can describe myself as one thing, but what I do ultimately defines me. And I think the conversation should not be about the meaning of Zionism, because we've had 100 years of illustrative examples of what Zionism is. The conversation should be about how do we abolish Zionism in a way that absolves and saves as many people as possible.
You talk about how in the struggle for Palestinian liberation, bearing witness is not enough on its own. What's your vision for achieving collective liberation?
It's really, really, really hard to answer. Like there's a lot, but I think there are parameters, right? I think there needs to be a redistribution of wealth. I think there needs to be a recognition of what has been, a reversal of what has been. There needs to be the right of return, the freeing of political prisoners. But I also, when I think of Palestinian liberation, I also think of global liberation. I think the past 15 months have shown us, yes, Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza, will bear the blunt edge of the occupation, but this project and the technologies of surveillance and repression and violence that it exports is something that will impact the majority of the world, particularly the poor among us. And so I'm not really concerned with ideas of like nationalism and ethno-states and so on and so forth. I don't want to get into that, but it's not, to me, it's more about dignity. Like it's about achieving a material, systematic manifestation of dignity where people feel dignified. I think in some interview, Nina Simone mentioned that freedom is having no fear. I think the highest form of liberation we can achieve is also within our hearts, where we are not afraid of our own thoughts and our own censorship. And I think this is unfortunately the case for many Palestinians who are not even under military occupation, but under an occupation of the mind here in this country and in other places in the West.
Mohammed El-Kurd, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.